So before we get started, I've never actually done a talk in the producer bootcamp. How many of you here are actually producers? Hands up. Oh, a lot of you. Okay. And how many? By the way, I can hardly see you at all. Like, you could all be giving me the finger. I would have no idea because these lights are super bright. How many of you are not producers yet, but you're thinking about it? Hands up. Okay, I'll try not to scare you. Excellent. And how many of you have had production responsibilities like thrust upon you against your will? Anybody? Are you guys indies? Indies in the house? My people are here. Yeah, so, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. That really helps me to know who's here, and I should probably return the favor. I'm Amy Dallas, and I run Clutch Play Games out of Portland, Oregon. And I've been a producer my entire adult life, and so I'm pretty excited to be here in the producer boot camp, because I think there's nothing more kind of reassuring than being in a room full of people who know how hard your job is, because I think not everybody understands how hard it is to be a producer. And it's the people stuff that's the hard part, right? It's never just quite as simple as asking your team to do things and expecting them to just come through. Some people can do that really readily, and some people can't. And I think that that's what initially drew me to the 4 tendencies. How many of you have heard of the 4 tendencies? You guys know this? Oh. Okay, all right. Sorry, everyone. Little technical difficulties with the necklace. So 4 tendencies, what this is, it's actually a book that was written by a woman named Gretchen Rubin, who is an author and a habit expert. And when she wrote this book, her goal was to basically come up with a framework to help people understand how the people around them deal with expectations, as well as how they themselves deal with expectations. And in doing her research, she found that there were kind of 2 flavors of expectations, both internal, these are the things that we expect of ourselves, and external, this is what other people want from us. And so in studying how different people dealt with both internal and external expectations, she found that people fell into kind of logically four behavioral groups. And those were upholders, obligers, questioners, and rebels. So just to give you a little sense of the high level of who the 4 tendencies are, what kind of people they are, upholders are people who very readily respond to both internal and external expectations. So they're pretty much high achievers, both personally and professionally, and whether it's a work goal or a personal project, when they decide to do something, they're just going to do it. It's as good as done. So these are people who are all about efficiency, achievement, and boundaries. So next you have the obligers. And obligers are also pretty good at meeting external expectations, but often they do so at the expense of meeting their own needs and aspirations. So these are pretty much people pleasers. They really value teamwork, they're dutiful, they're team-oriented, they're super loyal, and sometimes they place a higher value on all those things than self-care or taking care of their own personal goals and needs. So next you have the questioners, and questioners are interesting because they're not so focused on meeting those external expectations like the upholders and the obligers are, unless they feel that doing so is the correct and justifiable option. So when you're dealing with a questioner, these are people who value information, analysis, debate, and choice. So in the world of upholders and obligers, when you need something from them, all you got to do is ask. When you're dealing with a questioner, you pretty much have to convince them. And last but not least, you have rebels. And rebels actually present some really unique challenges for producers because they pretty much resist all expectations, both inner and outer. So if you ask them to do something that they're not interested in, not only are they just not going to do it, but they're not going to be able to make themselves do it either. So these guys do things their way or not at all. So they really value freedom, authenticity, taking chances, or taking on challenges, that interest them, and having choices. Sorry, I totally turn into Marco Rubio when I'm giving a talk. I get the dry mouth and I'm going to be hitting the water, so bear with me a little bit. Okay, so as I started, I was really interested in this because I thought, wow, this is something that I could use as a producer. This would really help me to understand not only the teams I manage, but the people who work at my company better. And as I started to study the 4 tendencies, I actually realized why my team actually worked really well together in certain circumstances, and why sometimes we had weird conflict. And it wasn't necessarily personality-based conflicts. Usually it was because we had some tendency clashes. So I found it really useful to understand at a deep level like the sort of upsides and downsides of each tendency, because I found it really helped me to understand how to work with these people much better. So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into the pros and cons of each one, the strengths and weaknesses. And I want to start off with the upholder. So upholders, as the name suggests, they uphold your expectations. They're really good at upholding rules and values. They're very, they're the upstanding citizens of your team. So they often tend to be really good in leadership roles because they're just super steady, they're really reliable, they're extremely self-disciplined, and they really value efficiency and time management. I actually have quite a few upholders on my team because we do consulting. Interestingly, my team is like almost 50-50 upholders and obligers. So we were kind of naturally predisposed to take on work where we have to meet a lot of intense client expectations, be very consistent, and deliver on time. So I find when I go to my upholders on my team, they are incredibly good at nailing their estimates always. If I ask an upholder, when is this due? And they'll say Friday, really they're probably gonna get it to me Wednesday night or Thursday morning. So these are people who very consistently under-promise and over-deliver. And they also just seem to have this magical time-bending ability to cram 12 hours of work in an 8-hour workday. I don't know how they do it, but they're just super efficient. And so because efficiency is so important to them, they tend to be really predictable and methodical, not only in their work, but in their habits. These are people who tend to show up on time, work a very focused day, and they don't want to work overtime. They are just going to leave when it's time for them to go because they want to focus on their own personal goals and their off hours. And for all those reasons, they're really good at setting boundaries for themselves, which a lot of the other tendencies are not. And so for all the aforementioned reasons, they just don't require a lot of supervision. These are the people on your team. You just set it and forget it. You tell them what you need, and then they just go off and do what you need them to do. So all of that is really good. Having someone who's highly organized and manages their time well is great. But as we all know as producers, sometimes efficiency and flexibility kind of don't coexist very comfortably together. And so often upholders can be seen as a little bit uptight, and they have a hard time going with the flow. And as we all know, sometimes you just need to roll with it. And so these are people who are going to have a little bit of a challenge with that. Another thing about upholders, and this is probably of particular note for any producer upholders out there, because there are often, upholders often end up being producers. They can be a little impatient with those who are not like them, because part of the upholder zeitgeist is they're just people who are good at everything. They decide to be good at something, and then they go off and make that happen. So they kind of don't get people who are inefficient, who need a lot of accountability or deadlines or supervision. They're kind of the people on your team who are like, why can't you just get it done? Just do it. And they also tend to be, because they're so careful, they tend to be not prone to making mistakes. They're methodical, they're careful, they don't screw up a lot. And so when they do, they tend to either take criticism really poorly, or they're really extra hard on themselves. So whenever one of my upholders makes a mistake, I really have to make sure they're not beating themselves up too hard or getting overly defensive. Again, a hallmark of being highly efficient is risk aversion, because part of not wanting to make mistakes means you don't want to take risks that might lead to a mistake. So, if you're on a project that requires people to be a little risk prone, this is going to be hard for the upholders on your team. And also sometimes they'll fail to challenge assumptions when necessary. And that's actually why upholders and questioners it's good to have a balance on the team, because an upholder is going to follow the rules. They're not going to necessarily say, gosh, is this the right thing to do? They're going to say, oh, is this what you want me to do? Great, I'll go ahead and do that. So, as I mentioned, I've got a lot of these people on my team, and having an understanding of what makes them happy and feel productive has really kind of changed the way I behave towards them or I run my studio. And one of the things that I've really learned is that upholders really thrive in an environment of efficiency, in a culture of efficiency. So they really cannot handle any time-wasty things. And so one of the changes that I've had to make is how I run my meetings, because I think the only thing an upholder hates more than a meeting is a meeting that's late, unfocused, and doesn't end on time. And so basically I had to kind of retrain my entire team to know you have to show up to meetings on time. You're gonna come prepared. We're gonna follow an agenda. And our goal is always to ditch out of the meeting as early as humanly possible. And when we actually cover all the items on the agenda, I tell everybody, all right, whoever wants to leave can go. And then usually I have questioners in the meeting. They're like, I have questions. And then another 20 minutes goes by when I'm actually answering all of their questions. Another thing that I've learned about upholders is they do not do well in an environment with a lot of mandatory overtime. And back in the day, I used to work at EA during the EA spouse time where there was a lot of mandatory overtime. And my particular team, I did not make them work overtime. I used to get in a lot of trouble for that, but I wanted them to be focused on efficiency. And efficiency and mandatory overtime are just, those are two very different cultures. An efficiency-based culture means I don't care how much time you spend here in the office, I just want you to get the work done. And that's very different than having an environment where you just have to have people in seats because it makes senior management feel better. I don't necessarily think that that's a super productive way to run a team, especially if you have a bunch of upholders. Another thing about this particular type is that they kind of don't accommodate last-minute change very well. And I've been in many circumstances where you have a team, you give them a deadline of Friday, and they work really hard to make that deadline, and then on Friday afternoon, someone from senior management actually says, oh, I changed my mind, I'm gonna change this whole feature around, I need everyone to come in over the weekend. That is pure torture for an upholder, because it basically feels like you changed the rules out from under them. They were efficient, they did what you asked them to do, and suddenly you're punishing them for something that's completely outside of their control. So I do try to push back against that whenever possible, whenever it comes up. If I do actually make my upholders work over the weekend, I usually slide them some comp time under the table because it is not fair to punish people because someone else changed their mind after they've been very careful about getting their work done. Don't like wasting time, so one of the things that I also recommend doing is being really clear in handing out your assignments and making your deadlines clear because they don't want to spin their wheels doing additional work that they didn't have to do. They don't need micromanagement, and another thing I've learned about these guys is they do not do well when you put them in the hot seat and they're not prepared. This is a lesson I learned the hard way with one of the guys on my team. This is someone who never screws up, he never does anything wrong, he's always super prepared, and I asked him to come onto a call with a lot of people. And the call went differently than I expected, and he didn't really handle it very well. He flipped out a little bit because he kind of felt like, wow, I'm gonna end up looking stupid in front of a bunch of strangers I don't know, and I'm not someone who ever looks stupid. So this is really bad, and he got a little, he was a little bit confrontational about that, and he just kind of dove off the call. And afterward, I think he thought I was going to be really mad at him because he didn't really handle it well. So, it was a mistake that he made, and I think he got a little defensive about it. And I'm like, no, this is my fault. You did nothing wrong. I did not set you up to be successful here. I know you need preparation. I did not give you an opportunity to do that. So I think we can all agree maybe you could have handled that a little better, but the learning opportunity here is really mine. I'm not going to put you in that situation again. So let's move on to the obligers. Now, obligers are great people when you're a producer to have them on your team. I imagine a lot of people in this room are actually obligers because that tendency lends itself to production pretty well. So like upholders, obligers are really good leaders generally, but for very different reasons. Upholders are good leaders because they're steady and steadfast, and obligers are good leaders because they actually care about people. So they're pretty team-oriented. They usually put the needs of others above themselves, so they're really selfless. They can be counted on to do what needs to be done in any given situation, and they usually work really long hours without complaint, and I'm not saying that's a good thing, but obligers are generally pretty willing to do that when necessary. And they've got a really strong desire to help others. So selfless, people-oriented, focused on being a supportive team member. However, do you guys recognize who that is? It's like a Full Metal Jacket guy, the soap in the sock. I think he's a perfect example of obligers gone wrong. So as great as it is to have all these qualities in a team member, there are some downsides too. So obligers are very easily derailed because they're a soft target for people who might want to get them to do extra stuff that they shouldn't be doing. I think we've probably all been in that situation. Like, as producers, we're often the gatekeepers, and so people know we're gatekeepers, so they're like, oh, you're totally gonna say no to me, so I'm gonna end run around to that person, and I'm just gonna plead my case and see if they'll work late to do my extra thing. And so not only is that a burden on them, because they feel like they can't say no, but often they end up working late at their own expense or being late on something that you expected them to do. So they also, unlike the upholders, they have a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver because they overcommit, and sometimes they're not good at delegating because they think, oh, I can do it, I can keep taking on all the stuff. And so for all those reasons, they're really susceptible to exploitation and burnout and overwork. And I gotta say, I have a lot of obligers on my team as well, and I take the weight of responsibility of taking care of them and not allowing them to burn themselves out really, really seriously. Because in the wrong hands, they can be mistreated and exploited. And last but not least, obligers are pretty interesting because they are people-focused and they do put the needs of others above themselves, but generally speaking, I have found that they do have some expectations that they don't normally articulate to people. Obligers are probably people on your team who might get really angry because you didn't give them a promotion or a raise, and you might think, well, you didn't ask me for what you wanted, and they'd be like, well, don't you see how hard I've been working? You should know that I deserve these things. And so when you have unmet expectations and you have someone who's working really hard, that is a powder keg of burnout opportunity. And that's what Gretchen Rubin calls obliger rebellion. That's the soap in the sock guy. If you abuse someone who's really kind and decent and team focused for too long, it can blow up in your face and they might suddenly quit for no reason, or not for no reason, but suddenly quit out of the blue. So managing obligers, again, I take the weight of this very seriously. And I have found that one of the biggest things that I've had to learn as I've understood this tendency more is to resist the temptation to lean on them too heavily, because I'll be honest, I have been guilty of this in the past. Some people on your team, they'll hassle you if you ask them to go above and beyond, and obligers almost never will, but that does not mean that they're the only ones that you should tap when you have some kind of needs as a producer. Running interference for them is big. Again, they're soft targets for predatory people who want them to do extra stuff. So one of the things about obligers is because they're so motivated by external expectations and they're not good at taking care of themselves, is they need some external accountability. So I've often found what's effective with them is saying, not only do I not want you to take on stuff that doesn't come from me because it's not in your best interest, I will actually be mad at you if you do. So if anyone comes to you with stuff that I have not asked you to do, I need you to send them to me. You should never have to be the bad guy. That's my job. It's another fun upside of being a producer. Another thing that's really important as leaders with obligers on your team, you gotta make it okay for them to set boundaries, because they struggle with that naturally. And so I have an obliger on my team, and we took on a project recently and had some really tight deadlines, and he was just killing himself. He was killing himself so much that at one point the client reached out to me at like midnight sent me a direct message, and he's like, I think I'm breaking your dude. I can't get him to just kind of settle down and recognize that I don't need him to work this hard. And I said, yeah, I got you, because I've had this conversation with him a few times. And so I sat down with him, and I'm like, I need you to understand, I think you feel like you're in a cage right now, but there's no lock on the door. You walked into the cage and shut the door, and you can walk out anytime you want, because I'm not asking you to beat your brains out, and neither is the client. So I so appreciate what you're doing, but I don't want you to burn out. So tell me what I can do to help you have some better boundaries. And he's like, every day, can you just DM me and tell me to stop working at a certain time? I'm like, done. Now, you might think that that's kind of weird and against your self-interest to get someone who really wants to work a lot to not work, but these are really valuable people on your team. And I would much rather have him set boundaries and not freak out and leave and keep him for a long time than to lose him because he just couldn't deal anymore with the pressure that was self-imposed. Acknowledging extra effort and showing appreciation is big for obligers, and I'm pretty sure everyone who's ever been a producer knows that this is important, but it's kind of amazing sometimes in the games industry you actually have to tell people, you should appreciate the team that works really hard. So, it's worth mentioning. So let's move on to the questionnaires. The questionnaires are super interesting. I personally feel like I've learned the most about this particular group because I'm not sure I understood people with a questionnaire tendency quite as well as I do now. So questionnaires, they pretty much want to gather facts and decide for themselves what to do and act with good reason. So in other words, they do what makes sense to them according to their best judgment. And questionnaires have the ability to meet both internal expectations. Questioners, once they've decided what they're going to do, they end up embodying the best of all the tendencies. They're self-directed, they're super reliable, and they're deeply authentic. So they are really good people to have on your team. But I think often, as I say, they're pretty misunderstood. They value information, logic, and efficiency above all. And so they're incredibly talented when it comes at looking at ways to improve systems and processes. So they're naturally inclined to look at something with a critical eye and wonder, is this the right way we should be doing it? And so to that end, they're really good at pushing boundaries and being change agents when needed. I think that, interestingly, the games industry is having a lot of questioners come in right now going, why has crunch always been a thing? Why do we have to do things this way? That's the questioner tendency kind of rising up. So questioners at their worst, they can be really tricky because the authenticity that drives them can be a really double-edged sword a lot of the time. And the questioner is going to act only when they feel something is right and reasonable. And so in the process of figuring that out, sometimes they can come across as being really stubborn and intractable and confrontational. In fact, the best questioner story I've ever heard came from a friend of mine, and she was always complaining to me about how her husband picked really stupid fights with her that would just escalate like crazy. And I said, well, give me an example. And she said, well, I was cooking last night, and I'm making dinner, and he comes into the kitchen and is like, how old is that butter? And she's like, what are you accusing me of? Using old butter? Like, what is this about? And so then it escalated into this huge fight. And so when she told me this, I'm like, I'm going to text you a link to a book and maybe get back to me. And about a week later, she texts me, upholder, husband, questioner, and then parentheses, she writes, dude just wanted to know how old the butter was. And I'm like, dude just wanted to know how old the butter was. So this is the thing about questioners. Like, sometimes their desire to get to the heart of information, if they feel they're not getting answers or they feel they're being stonewalled, they're going to get stubborn and they're going to dig in and potentially become really obstructionist. And another thing about questioners, because they're so data focused, they can sometimes get really paralyzed in terms of taking action because they're like, I'm not sure this is the exact perfect thing. I got to keep researching. And so sometimes it can be hard for them to get a stake in the ground. As we all know as producers, that is not a good scene. That's challenging. Analysis paralysis, big deal for them. And ironically, they often don't respond well to being questioned themselves, which I find really funny. Like, they will hammer you with questions, and then when you ask them a question, they're like, yeah, I'm not going to answer that. And I think the reason for that is because they feel like they spend so much time and energy coming to the right conclusion that they don't want to be questioned by someone else, because they feel like their decision-making skills are superior to other people's because they're so well researched. So managing questioners, one of the most important things that I've learned from this experience is don't take it personally. Sometimes they appear really confrontational, and sometimes they really make it feel like they're challenging your authority. And really, that is not what they're trying to do. It may seem that way, but really, they just want answers and they want to make smart decisions. And so I feel like I have so much more compassion for questioners now that I understand what makes them tick. Give them time and space to research their stuff. Ooh, I'm getting the hook, man. I've got to move this along. Give them time and space to research their stuff. I find sometimes questioners are not good at doing estimates because they think something's going to take a certain amount of time, and then they get into it and they're like, is this the right way to do this? Maybe I have to actually do some more research. So I usually pad their time up significantly. And again, I always make sure that at every meeting, I give them an opportunity to ask their questions. Another thing that's good about working with a questioner, another good way to do it, is if you want to cut down on the amount of argument, time, and debate, just give really thoughtful justifications when you assign work. Here's what I want you to do. Here's why we're going to do it. Here's the purpose it's going to serve. And generally, I find when I do that, they're like, oh, okay. So when asking questions, also be prepared to explain why you're asking. Again, questioners don't want to answer questions. So if you say, when will you be available for this meeting? I want to know because my schedule is very booked and I'm trying to get some answers from you, and I need to do that in between all these other things. So I am running low on time, so let me move on to the rebels, last but not least. One thing I want to say about rebels is that in the context of this conversation, I just want to be clear about what I'm talking about, because often I think people look at someone who might physically look like a rebel. They might have like a cheek piercing and crazy hair and wearing a tutu, and they think, oh, you're a rebel. Maybe not. Maybe they're a questioner who's like, why should I look like you think I should look, right? So in the context of this conversation, we're really talking about how people deal specifically with expectations. And again, rebels, I know that they kind of do things their own way and they have their challenges, but they can be really great. I have a rebel on my team and he is fantastic. So they're really, independently minded, super creative, very out-of-the-box thinking, very out-of-the-box thinkers. They often look at things very differently than anyone else on the team. They do really well when you give them work that aligns with things that they're interested in doing, or their passions or their values. And they love taking on really big, hard, interesting challenges, and they can be super productive as long as they're allowed to do things the way that they want to do them. So rebels at their worst, when you see the whole list, you'll go, yeah, that picture's appropriate. So, pretty much rebels are going to do what they're going to do in all circumstances. And so they are not particularly team-oriented, and somehow that can sometimes cause frustration amongst the other tendencies. They will almost always resist something that you give them to do, and they're not super good at following directions, so you never want to approach a rebel and say, here's what I want you to do, and here's how I want you to do it. They're just going to be like, nope, and walk away. So again, they can kind of come off as stubborn and uncooperative because they're really kind of committed to their own authentic experience of life. Another thing about rebels, and this is hard for us as producers, is they really struggle with routines and planning and small mundane tasks. I'm going to say probably there's not a lot of rebel producers in this room. I don't think there are a lot of rebel producers at all, because so much of what we do is just kind of tedium and routine tasks. And they also have trouble accomplishing tasks that require consistency, and they really have a hard time with deadlines. So they're like the anti-upholder. Now, in terms of managing rebels on your team, first and foremost, it's really helpful to understand what motivates them and kind of assign them tasks accordingly. So when I have a rebel on my team, and again, he's fantastic. He's just, I could not love him more. And when assigning him work, I kind of tend to focus on the problem that I want him to solve versus here, do a thing. I'm like, instead of just saying what I want him to do, I'm like, here is what we need to figure out. And he loves stuff like that. But as far as getting a rebel to do something, you kind of have a very small number of options. You tell them what the possibilities are. You say, okay, well, we have option A, and there's the consequence for option A. There's option B, consequence for that. Option C, another consequence. Maybe there's another thing you want to do. Come and tell me about that, and we'll figure out what the consequences are. And then you'd pretty much just let them choose without judgment or any impulse to micromanage. And once they make that choice, you got to hold them accountable. And this is the hardest part of dealing with rebels, because as producers, we never want things or people to fail. And a couple of years ago, I actually worked had an issue with a rebel on a project. And this person she was great at what she did. She was admired by the whole department. She was just an incredible powerhouse when she was engaged in what she was doing. But as we all know, games require a lot of tedium, right? When you get to that bug fixing time, there's no more features, there's only bugs. This was pure torture for her. And so she was running around fomenting discontent, not showing up, not being productive. And obviously, this wasn't something that I could kind of allow to continue. So I sat down with her and said, okay, look, I understand that you don't like doing this kind of work. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to try and get one big feature added back into scope. And I'm going to give you that feature. But if we do that, because everybody else is going to be doing bug fixing, when that's over, obviously I need to go back to bug fixing. So this is a concession I'm willing to make. And she's like, yep, absolutely, I'm willing to make that concession too. So I held up my end. I got the feature uncut. And the time came, and she's like, nope, not going to do it. And so I sat down with her and said, okay, do you remember the agreement we made? And she said, yes. And I said, do you feel I held up my end of the bargain? And she said, yes. And I said, do you think you held up your end of the bargain? And she's like, nope. And so I said, well, you know what has to happen now, right? And that was pretty much the end of her time on the team. And it was sad to see her go. But it was actually okay with her as well, because she recognized that it was a decision that she was making, and she understood that she was the one who didn't hold up her end of the bargain. So accountability is super important. You can't let people run around and kind of just decide what they are and aren't going to do. Oh, I'm getting the hook. I'm getting the hook back there. Last but not least, if you're interested in finding out what tendency you are or what tendency your team is, you can take this quiz. You can actually also Google this, Gretchen Rubin 4 Tendencies quiz. I highly recommend it. As producers, it'll change your life. When GDC is over, go get this book. It is full of interesting producer shit. So thank you so much. Happy GDC to y'all.